What we're going to be talking about today is really a continuation of the end of chapter 1. So it's a very brief review, and just kind of, especially when you get into the prison epistles or the some of these other shorter ones, it's interesting to me to be able to take these letters and shove them back into the book of Acts. Because when you shove them back into Acts, you reread that book very differently. I'll give you an Old Testament example, and I challenge you to do this sometimes. You know, when you do your daily Bible reading and you go through in Old Testament, Genesis, all the way through Malachi. That's the order that we have it in our Bible. Sometimes I challenge you to do this. Read the prophets with the stories in Kings and Chronicles, and go there and you see it very differently. I challenge you to do the same thing here, is that when you understand these, especially the Go Eat Popcorn books, Go Eat Popcorn, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, now I remember them. Those, infuse them back into Acts, it sort of widens your understanding of this book. So what we're going to see here is, in chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "Then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and also took Titus with me." This most likely is going to be Acts chapter 15. If you look at Acts 15, verse 2, we have just, I think, only a handful recorded instances where Paul's going to Jerusalem. There could have been others that we don't have recorded. That's cool. That's not, my point is not to determine that. It's not really, doesn't have a bearing on us. But most likely, we're talking about Acts chapter 15. But let's go back before that. What was Acts chapter 10 about? Flip over. Okay. And so before, who went to Cornelius? Which apostle?
Peter.
Okay, before Peter went to Cornelius, what did Peter have to have directly from the Lord? He had to have the most interesting vision, fascinating from little kids all the way up. And what was that vision? And Peter, how many times that vision had to happen?
3 times.
3 times it had to happen. It's like, hey, and he got it. Because why? You're taking thousands of years of Judaism, of the Old Testament law, and he said, this is unclean. And what I have made, it is not unclean, it is made holy. And so now everything changes in the New Testament, in the Lord's church, which started in what chapter? That's right, Acts 2. So Acts 2, we have a new church. And that's the beginning of it. Who was accepted into the church then? All right, we have the Jews that were there. And then in chapter 10, we now have who accepted in? The Gentiles. Who do we have accepted in chapter 8? Everyone forgets this one.
Ethiopian. Oh, the jailer. Philippian jailer.
Before.
Paul.
Your same chapter?
Lydia.
Paul's a little bit later. What's the first part of 8 about? We always forget that.
Simon the sorcerer.
But what was he? What were they? Samaritans. They were accepted. Because what were Samaritans? Half Jews, half Gentiles. So, 2, 8, 10, Jews, Samaritans, Gentiles. Did we leave anyone out? That's everybody. This was one of the hardest concepts for people to get, and Paul fought this constantly. And so really, this was a line that I thought was interesting, is that did a person have to become a Jew before they could become a Christian in the New Testament church? The answer we know is no. But that's easy for us to understand. That was hard for them because why? If you were a Jew, that was your religion. That was also who you were. That was your culture. That would be like I said, well, Christian is a race. We don't have that today. Why? Because all races can be Christian. Whereas back then, it was hard for them to separate that. So what was going back to Philippians, I don't want to spend too much on backstory, but in Philippians chapter 1, what was that about? You can look at the headings, I don't care, that's fine. But what was chapter 1 all about?
Living for Christ.
That's right. We're living for Christ, and I always have to mention, whenever we do Galatians, Paul's so nice. Galatians, I'm good. So and as soon as you get to verse 6, it's like, I'm amazed that you're already basically falling away. That's basically what they're doing. And that either I or an angel from heaven delivered another gospel. There is no other gospel. And so he jumps straight into it. And then notice in verse 11, what is he going to start doing? He is building a case about what? Starting in chapter 1, verse 11, that does not stop until chapter 3. What case is he building?
Gospels is for me, or for many men.
That's right. What is Paul?
An apostle.
An apostle. He deals with it so many times. And in this book, I always say Galatians is the Cliff Notes of Romans. because it's kind of taking everything that Romans really communicated and made it real simple. And so that's why I love coming here. Chapter 3 of this book, whoever's doing that one, is one of the best chapters in the New Testament if you want to understand why we're not under Old Testament law anymore. I don't have that one, so we're going to do 2. And so in my Bible, the heading for chapter 2, verse 1 starts with defending the gospel. This is pertaining to Paul's defense of the gospel. He's already defended his apostleship. He's already shown who he saw in Jerusalem. He's going to continue to do so. Basically, what he's doing is almost like Luke would have done. I'm going to give you an accurate account of what happened. If I wasn't there, I wouldn't know this. That's what he's going to do. And then he gets into a fight with Peter. That's cool. And so let's go from there. So starting up here, could you read verse 1? And I'll stop you. I'll just start serpentining around. I'll stop you when you need to.
Just one verse.
Just one verse.
Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and also took Titus with me.
Okay, so the 14 years is after his conversion, which was, when was Paul's conversion? What chapter? 9. Very good. The actual account happened in Acts chapter 9. So 14 years after, that's where we're at, that we're talking about this instance right there, Logan.
And I went up by revelation and communicated to them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to those who are of reputation, lest by any means I might run or had run in vain.
Okay, so what we have here is that he is now saying that I talked. Who did he talk to when he went to Jerusalem? Who's he referring to? You go back to Acts 15. This is sometimes called the Council of Jerusalem. I don't really care for that because the Bible never calls it that. But that's when we have James. That's when we have the meeting there. That their whole discussion that they're having there is about, is circumcision necessary? And of course it's not. But the point is that they're saying here is that he went up, he talked to those who were of reputation, lest by any means I might run or run in vain. Basically, remember what Paul, after he was converted, he went to Jerusalem. And like I said, there's multiple trips to Jerusalem. And one of the things I always find interesting is that mentioned in here was Barnabas. And what made Barnabas so important right after Paul's conversion?
Because he was established already.
Yes. And Barnabas, he was the one that was like, he's cool. Because what everybody else think, justifiably, like he's a spy. Like he took my aunt and uncle in to prison, and now we're cool? Having the Lord's Supper together? Imagine that. Someone sitting right there that would have persecuted you and your family. They even wrote letters to have them killed. Now they're sitting there? I try to put myself in their shoes. That's hard. That makes Barnabas an amazing individual. Like, no, it's okay. So you go back and read that account. Very impressive, I think. Okay, keep reading.
Yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised.
Okay, stop right there. All of that right here. It's easier to go verse by verse. I typically don't like to go verse by verse, but when we're doing chronological accounts like this, it just kind of makes sense to. But so all of this, Titus is with me. No one with me here is thinking they need to go back to Judaism. That's going to be important by the time we get to the end of the chapter. Tyler, go ahead.
And that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage.
Okay, let's stop right there too. So this is, I always think, a fascinating lesson. We're talking about Judaizing teachers. What does that mean? We always hear it in lessons. What is a Judaizing teacher?
They want you to hold to the Jewish traditions
Exactly.
in order to be a Christian.
Exactly. These are New Testament Christians that are backsliding into the law. That's what they're doing. In some cases, you also have just Jews that were coming. You go back to Acts and you read that, there were actual Jews following them around. But the problem that they're addressing here is that these are Christians that are wanting to work themselves back into the law. Notice what is said. And this occurred because of what type of brethren? False. Notice what it says here, a false brethren. We know what that means. We know what a false teacher is. There's the right way, and there's the wrong way. And so a false teacher is the one that teaches the wrong way. And typically, is a false teacher going to stand up there with a megaphone and say, "This isn't right"? What does it describe a false teacher doing?
Secret spy.
Why?
That's how they work.
Why?
Because they don't want attention brought to themselves.
But why? Show it. Yeah, you're doing great. Peel it back. Go on.
Well, it's easier to convert one person at a time instead of You know, you can convince somebody one-on-one, it's harder to convince them in a crowd.
Exactly. Because you need supporters. False teachers need supporters. And what do? If you have a congregation of these people and you've got a strong core, maybe elders, preachers, just families that are strong, and you've got weaker ones on the fringes, it's just, remember what we are. We are sheep. And those wolves, do they want to fight? Do they chase the strong ones? They want the weak ones. And that's just what a false teacher does. This is a lesson not on, be careful, false teachers. This is a lesson that's be strong. Don't stop growing and like, oh, I've learned enough. I know how to be in the church. I'm in the Lord's church. I'm good. No. Do you know how to talk to people about alcohol? Do you know how to talk to people about different subjects that are hard, that are difficult? Can you use Matthew 19 to show what a correct marriage is? All of these things can be, this is how false teachers work. They come in and you're like, have you ever considered ... And that's where it begins. I remember years ago in Rockport, when Tom was serving as an elder, people moved in, and I remember them talking, and it's always, it's in between services, or it's after services, or it's at the fellowship meal. And I remember listening, I was like, that's a false teacher. It had to be addressed. And they did address it. And it's like, that's how it works, is finding the weak ones and trying to pick them off. The worst thing a false teacher can do is like, hey, have you ever considered next to a strong Christian? That's awesome to see. It's like, absolutely not. No, and this is it, and this is the verse, and they're like, oh, what does that false teacher do? Hey, we're just talking here. They're slippery, they're slimy. But that requires us to have a base knowledge that we can defend the truth. So, moving on. Laura, if you could read the next one.
To whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you.
Do you mind if I read New King James? Would that be okay?
Oh, yes.
Okay, yeah. And to whom we did not yield submission even for an hour, and the truth of the gospel might continue with you. That was the false teacher whispering in someone's ear right next to the Apostle Paul, or next to Titus, or something like that. And remember Titus, the Holy Spirit inspiring, remember Paul inspiring his letter to Titus about the elders in chapter 1. What was one of the reasons they gave that they needed elders at Crete?
To set things in order.
They set things in order, and then you move that the mouths of false teachers will be stopped. Yeah, that they will be shut. Does that sound like false teaching isn't a big deal? Like you can just let it in. It's like, you know what, if it gets too far, we'll shut it down. No. And as Laura read in the King James so eloquently, and basically what it's saying is, we didn't yield to false teaching. Christianity is not a weak religion. It's not, sometimes we think, oh, it's all love. That is love. And until people realize that it can be done in an unloving way, an unloving way. But Philippians 4:15, all that we do, we speak the truth in, but we speak it. We have to speak it. We have to say it. We have to do it. And did they yield even for an hour? That phrase, that's 2,000-year-old phrase, and we still exactly know what that means. We didn't put up with it. I imagine someone getting up in a public assembly started saying something, and one of them were like, no. And I mentioned before, I've heard so many accounts of elders, or where they didn't have elders, where a strong man would stand up and be like, no, that's not right, to someone in a pulpit. That's the kind of strength that we need to have. I remember when we started the congregation here, is that we told each other we have to have that kind of strength. We can research speakers. I mean, we have. I always tell when we travel, we say we have the longest gospel meeting of any congregation I know because we have people come every 2 weeks, and it's like we know all these people the best we can, but will we be strong enough to be like, no, this is not true? And that's the kind of strength that we're talking about here. Next verse, please.
Verse 6.
Yeah.
But from those who seem to be something, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God shows personal favoritism to no man. For those who seem to be something added nothing to me.
I love it. This was a book filled of parenthetical phrases like, this is what I'm telling you, and by the way, this is how I feel about it. It's like, because it's a little sarcasm in there. Because look at what he's saying. For those who seem to be something, that is a description of a false teacher. Well, I've thought of something new. 2,000 years of the church, nobody's ever thought about musical instruments this way. Yeah, we did. You ever hear, and I love it, I love hearing old-time preachers, old-time elders, old-time Christians in general that have already dealt with this, and like, we dealt with that in the 40s, we dealt with that in the 60s, we dealt with that in the 80s, we dealt with, there's nothing new, and these false teachers think they're revolutionary. No one's ever thought of this. Someone's thought of it. And it's been proven false time and time again. So that's what it comes down to. What does a false teacher want?
Instill doubt.
Yeah, they want to instill doubt. And if you can chip away at that faith, this is what I always say is that which in the armor of God, what is our faith?
Shield.
The shield. I always, in my mind, think of a new Christian as having the wooden shield. And the darts of the devil are made of what? What do they describe as? Fiery. How long is a wooden shield going to last? With fire on it? Not very long. That's why our faith has to grow. That's why our faith, imagine it going from wood to metals and to harder substances. And that also falls on us as Christians who have more developed faiths. We wrap ourselves around these new Christians. These ones who are young in the faith, whether they be young Christians, whether they be just new Christians who are adults. We surround themselves. I always think of that Roman turtle that they would do, and they would form, and, they would protect each other because the shield's interlocked. That's how I always envision the church and how we should approach new Christians because, as Tom said, you got a strong faith here. Let me just whittle a little piece off. Maybe just a little bit off. What happens if you whittle too much of a shield off? What's left? The handle. That's all you have. You have nothing to protect yourself against temptation and trials and all that comes at you. So,
Hey, Jerry.
yo,
It's like Jude 12 talking about those false teachers. I love the description there. It says, "These are spots in your love feast, while they feast with you without fear, serving only themselves. They are clouds without water, carried about by the winds, seeming to be something." It's like a cloud that you look at and think it's going to pour, it's going to rain, and it brings nothing.
so
It's a false hope.
and it's so true. And in the middle of that, it said, without fear. That's a rebuke of those around that person. They need to be scared. They need to be like, keep your mouth shut. You do not say that here. You need to grow. I mean, the thing is that a false teacher that comes in, there's an Apollos, right? He just taught what he didn't know. And he was corrected, and he changed, and he moved on. We're talking about people who are like, I'm going to twist the church into something for me. I'm going to change the faith so it benefits me. Their God is their belly. It's their desires or what they want. And the point is that if false teachers are allowed to run, that's because they have no fear. They should be scared. They should wake up and be like, my hope is that false teachers, I'm wrong. And that's one of the hardest things is talking to a brother, never had to deal with a sister, but with a brother that is adamant about their position, which is against the scriptures. And that's one of the hardest things is to try to show them the truth. But hopefully in time they will. That's all we can do. But it requires addressing. All right, verse 7.
But on the contrary, when they saw that the gospel for the uncircumcised had been committed to me, as the gospel for the circumcised was to Peter.
Kristen, read 8 as well.
For he who worked effectively in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked effectively in me toward the Gentiles.
Okay, so as they run up to Jerusalem, I always wondered, when you make it to heaven one day, it's like, is there any way I could see what happens? Like, is there like a movie reel in heaven to be like, can you show me what Acts look like? Like, this is an instance brought ever so slightly of Paul and the original apostles. Paul refers to himself as the least of all apostles because of what he did and what have you. But as we see here is that he is now, what did Paul want to do? Who did he want to preach to? Who did he want to go to? He wanted to go to Jews. That's what he wanted to do. You go to Romans chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. Always remember that teaching with your dad. That was the first memory verse he wanted to do. Is that his desire was for the Jews. Did they listen to him? Who did he go to? What did the Lord tell Paul? No, sorry. What did the Lord tell Ananias? He is a vessel for me, and he's going to the Gentiles. That would make sense in my mind. Like a Jew of Jews. He really was, right? He gave his laundry list of qualifications. Man, send him to the Jews. But God's so smart, isn't he? Send him to the Gentiles. Then Jews won't listen to him. Gentiles will. And that's what's so interesting. You know how many Gentiles followed him? Timothy? we have so many Gentiles that went with Luke. You know, we didn't see just an overwhelming amount of Jews that went with him. So, very fascinating. And Bo, verse 9 and 10, please. That's all right. 9 and 10.
And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, received the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. They desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I also was eager to do.
What were the three names of Peter? Simon, Peter, and Cephas. In this book, it goes between Cephas and Peter. I've never seen a reason why. It just does. I don't know if he's bringing out different parts of it. Cephas is referring in the Greek version of his name. And so I don't really know the difference in that. It doesn't really matter. I just thought I'd point it out, especially if we have younger ones in here, to make sure that they know that that is Peter. Who seemed to be pillars. That was just the truth of it. They were seen to be pillars. Were they actually pillars? Were they actually what the church was built on? No. But by going to them, I think some of this is so much tongue-in-cheek. I mean, it is true. I mean, you had James at Jerusalem Council. You had Peter who's going out who did the opening sermon. You know, you've got all these things. And his point in doing this, almost like what we got through with in 2 Corinthians 11. All right, sorry, but I have to speak carnally because of this. But he's going through things that I know it probably killed Paul. I've got to waste 2 chapters. I know the word chapters back there. I've got to waste 2 chapters defending myself before I even get to the point that I'm writing to you about. But the point is here is that they met, they see the work that they have, and Barnabas, they extended to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. I love that phrase. It's like the two of y'all with the Roman, you know, the Spartan handshake. That's how I kind of view it as, is that here you had, just I want you to picture that again. Here you have someone who killed people. He son, not with his hand, but he wrote letters and had them brought into jail and killed Christians. And now he's a worker for the Lord. And this was so hard for the New Testament church to understand and to see here that they gave me the right hand of fellowship. Think of Peter. What did Peter do before Jesus' crucifixion? He denied it. How many times? You think he ever forgot that? You think he ever forgot that? Do you think all the other disciples, let's take Judas out of there, he had his own issues, but the other 11, and always, they had some doubt. I mean, Thomas, even Andrew with the loaves and fishes, you keep going back and all of the times that the disciples doubted, or in Peter's case, denied, or, you know, I would have looked back in such embarrassment when if my mom, you know, James and John's, came and was like, hey, make sure my sons are at your right hand in your coming kingdom. All of these things that must have been so embarrassing later, and to look back in this, is that they all had their own baggage that they carried with them. Peter, knowing that he denied, and never mentioned again in his epistles that he writes, but Paul, what he had to carry, when he says, I'm the least of all apostles, that's what I always think of. It's like, I persecuted Christ. Remember when the Lord came and called him and said, why, Saul, Saul, why do y'all persecute me? When did he ever persecute Jesus?
Persecuted with the church.
That's right. You can't separate Jesus from the church. That's a great lesson when we hear today, oh, I don't do church, but I love Jesus. That's interchangeably used. That is the bride and the bridegroom coming together there. So that ends the little section there. What was the desire also of Paul in verse 10?
Also to go to the poor.
That's it. You know what's interesting to me, were the disciples in general, turned apostles, they got the new name card, and even Paul in this case. Paul would have come from money. I mean, the position that he held, the training that he had, he would have been, I would compare him a lot of like Matthew, Levi, same kind of position of standing. And he left all that. And what was his occupation? Who taught him?
No, the couple.
I don't know.
Ananias?
Nope.
No.
They got cooked.
Priscilla.
There you go. Brother Priscilla. Very good.
The other A.
Ananias and fire. Before they sold their mom. Yeah. I don't remember my point of that. That's funny.
He had money.
He had money. So he had money. And the thing is that he became a tent maker. I can't see where a tent maker is like, oh, I'm doing good in the world. I just can't see that based on the position it is now, going back historically. And talking about the poor. These apostles were poor. They didn't have homes. I mean, what they had, I don't know. I mean, we know that Matthew did. I don't know if that was given up. I don't know if certain, maybe they did. I shouldn't say that. But the point is that generally these were not rich people, or even or what we call middle class means and anything. But that the affection was always for those with less. You know, Romans 12 is like, condescend to those of lowly estate. That was Paul's mind. I want to help people that have less than me. I want to help people that spiritually have less than me, physically have less than me. Whatever the case is that is someone. Can you necessarily raise yourself up to higher stature? You can't do that in the sense as of the Romans 12 teaching that you can easily humble yourself and do that, because that's the Christian direction, right? Humble yourself, not exalt. And so as we get into, we have basically the altercation. And what I find so interesting is that we know Galatians 2:20. Can anyone say that verse without singing it? I can't. So I'm going to sing it by the time I get there. And as we're all singing through that, it's funny, the fact that was Paul admonishing Peter. And that's what I find so interesting about that, is while we're singing the devotionals and stuff like that, that was actually a rebuke. But we're going to break the rebuke down, because I've never actually done that in a class, so I want to accomplish that today. So let's pick up in 11. Billy, we'll start with you. And will you be able to read too? Okay, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15.
Now when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed.
For before certain men came from James, he would eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision.
And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy.
But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, live in the manner of Gentiles and not as the Jews, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews?
We who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles.
Okay, so let's break this apart real quick. I was supposed to look at my word here before I got here. Okay, that's the one I needed. All right, so what we have here, we know the situation. We have the situation here where we have Paul is admonishing Peter because of what? What did he do?
Segregation.
Yes, he withdrew himself from the Gentiles when other Jews were present. Not necessarily even Judaizing teachers or false teachers, but just when other Jews were present. This is what I did. I'll show you what I did in my Bible, and that's what we're kind of building this first part on here. Please don't care. See this word in verse 12? Fearing. Sorry. It says fearing. I can see it. I don't know what your problem is. So, in verse 12, fearing. That's the third time and last time I'll say it, maybe. This is the heart of several descriptors I want to pull from. What was Peter's motivation that he left the Gentiles and went to the Jews? Fear. Why?
Because of how they
What he would say.
Because it's like, I lived the book of Acts. I saw what them Jews did to Paul. I tried to. Yeah, poor guy got stoned. Where? Where did Paul get stoned? Very good. Lystra. Listerine, that's right. That's where he did it. So that was, Peter saw like, I like not being stoned. So that, whatever the motivation was, but that was the heart of it. Now, what does Paul tell Timothy? God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of self-control, and love and self-control. He has not given us a spirit of fear. Why? Because I fear not what man can do to me. Yes, go ahead.
Finish your thought.
You don't want to do that. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to go back and say those certain men, those Jews that he was afraid of, came from James. So they were. I mean, am I wrong that they were actually converted to Christians?
Yeah.
And so they weren't going to even physically harm him or arrest him or turn him in.
Mm-hmm.
It was just what they would think.
And that
Which
was
is sadder, I think, that it wasn't even a justified fear. It was just he was worried about what they would say to him or how they might look down on him.
Yeah, and this is after Acts 15, so it's already been discussed with those that came. And so that's the point, is that they weren't coming, these were not false teachers. When I was a young Christian, I used to think, oh, these false teachers came in and were convincing Peter. That's not what it says. They were cultural Jews turned Christians. That's all it was. But he still felt.
But they were probably still holding to that false teaching that he's trying to convince them they don't need to, which is that they needed to be circumcised and keep part of the law.
Exactly. And so what we have here is, out of fear, let's reread some of this. Look at verse 11. The very first word I want us to notice, this is not on Peter, this is on Paul. I withstood him. What do you think that looked like? I withstood him not only, but to his face.
You would talk to him.
You went and talked to someone. You know what Paul didn't do? Titus, can you believe this? Look, Peter over there doing all that. He didn't do that, did he?
A vague sermon.
Yeah, I don't want to step on any toes. No, he withstood him to his face. Because what would have happened if Peter's influence could have kept going? I mean, it already pulled away who? We already know where this is. Barnabas. I mean, Barnabas, yeah. And Paul never forgot, I'm sure, that Barnabas, even after their contention, that guy did help me when I got started as a Christian. And even he's being pulled away. So I imagine that fiery indignation, I'm sure, came up in Paul. And so we see first is that because he was to be, very important word here, what is it? Blamed. There's a difference between leading a life of sin and being blamed. The point is that, and I think it's so interesting, he didn't say sin or anything like that. He is. I mean, he's wrong. But to be blamed means is that you're going to be corrected, and Paul knew he's going to overcome this.
What's one of the qualifications of an elder? You know, he's supposed to have a good report
Yeah.
in the church and without.
Yeah.
And how are you going to do that if you're blamed?
Yeah. And the thing is that the word blamed is important as an elder qualification, because does it mean you're perfect?
No.
No, it means
They can't hold anything against you.
exactly like, hey, this is not right. Yep, you're right. I'm sorry. Repent of that. Go over that. That, because what was one of the descriptors of Job as well?
He was blameless.
He was blameless. That doesn't mean you're perfect. None of us are perfect, but can you live blameless? Yes. I was talking to your dad about some of the places they were trying out this window. I said, oh, I sin every day. He said, well, stop. Well, he looked back. I was like, look, we sin. But if you ain't ever there, like, well, I've got some lust in here in about 30 minutes, and, I think I might steal something. Whatever. It's like, let's get that out of our life. We don't live lives that are to be held to our account or living in a state of sin. Read 1 John sometime, I think 2 or 3, chapter 2 and 3, talks about the idea of when you live in sin, that's the comment, it's chronic sin that you're living. I like chronic because that's like a condition, like a medical condition. You're in chronic sin, you're Satan. So what we have here is that he's to be blamed, he's done something wrong, but he's going to be addressed. So moving on, we have in verse 12 the word fear, but look at 13. Because of his fear, he was to be blamed because he was doing something that was wrong. His influence was wrong. He played the hypocrite. And look what it says. The rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite. What do you think that phrase looks like? What does it mean to play a hypocrite? I don't know of that phrase anywhere else exactly like that. I mean, we know the lesson of what a hypocrite was. It was the actor that wore a false mask. But how was he doing that there?
He was preaching no segregation and segregating.
Exactly. And that's something, as a teacher, preacher, I don't care who you are, just as a Christian to your neighbor. If you're like, you really can't drink, that's ultimate hypocrisy, isn't it? That was the whole point. Don't look at me like that. So you go to go to Romans chapter 2. I love Romans chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Because all of chapter 1 was Paul bragging to the Gentiles, right? And then he's like, I can just see him, he turns to the Jews and they're like, and you people, you say one thing, and it's a great chapter on judgment. Like, you judge these Gentiles for doing this, and you're doing the same thing. And that's exactly what he's doing. So Peter was to be blamed. He played the hypocrite. That even Barnabas, what does it say? That phrase is to be lifted up and moved. What are we supposed to do? One of the greatest verses is 1 Corinthians 15:58. We are to be, that's right, strong, and we are steadfast, immovable. That's what our faith is. Michael read about false teachers. They're waves, they are clouds, they're going to be clouds, everything moves. In the faith, we are to be secured, aren't we? But if we're not secured, what happens? We can be picked up and we can be carried away by false teaching. That's exactly what's happening here. Peter's influence was leading people away from the faith. Yeah.
It's like Ephesians 4:14. I actually was just looking at that. Let me turn to that. I just marked it down.
Okay.
But it's talking about how you are not to be carried away by every wind of doctrine. Go ahead and read it. It says that we should no longer be children tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting.
Oh, very good. And deceitful plotting, that's a great descriptor of a false teacher. A false teacher doesn't wake up one morning and accidentally start leading people astray. Is that it's an intentional leading astray. Look what also it says is that we have to be carried away. Look at verse 14. They were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel. That, I think, is a warning for all of us. Even not if you're intentionally not being a false teacher, but am I straightforward with teaching? Do I address the hard things? Am I going to bring up the things that are difficult? We kind of talked about that on Wednesday night. We've got the whole counsel of God. Am I going to drop that off? And I'll bring up my example the other night was that if we're studying with a non-Christian and we know they're in an unscriptural marriage, are we going to touch that? Because that's hard and uncomfortable. It's unloving if you don't. And also, there's a way to deliver the truth in an unstraightforward manner. And the truth is that we need to be very plain. You know, I remember hearing it from first becoming a Christian. Like, how am I going to teach other people? I said, well, you knew enough to become a Christian. And you mentioned that point quite often. It's like, this is what I learned, this is what I did, I'm going to share with you. You know, and that's what it is, isn't it? And the truth is so straightforward. Why? Because it's here, and it's objective. That's one of the best things about truth. Well, you got your truth, I got my truth, and we'll meet in the middle in heaven and have a good laugh about it. I hate to tell you, brother, but that's not the truth.
One truth.
Yeah, there's one truth, and it is straightforward upon its delivery. He begins his rebuke in verse 14. And he says, why did you compel the Gentiles? Built this case is that out of fear, let's do left to right. Okay, so out of fear of the Jews, he started, through his actions, change something. But through his actions, he compelled the Jews, he compelled the Gentiles. It doesn't say he said anything to the Gentiles, does it? Maybe he did, but we don't have that written. All we know is that he removed himself from the Gentiles. And so this teaches us our actions are teachers as well. Now, I remember as a young Christian thinking, well, my actions will be stronger than what I tell people. That's not true. We have to teach with words, but it also is very easy. We teach with our actions. That's how you be non-hypocritical. That's how you have a genuine faith. He says this, he does this. He doesn't say this, he doesn't. He says not to do this, he doesn't do it. You know what I'm saying? That's the kind of faith we need to have. That's the kind of Christians we need to be. And realize, I didn't say a word to that. Well, you don't know who you influenced by what you did. Now let's take the good side of that. We've known people that come forward that, you know, have said, like, because I saw so-and-so's actions, that made me change my mind. Our actions are teachers too, and don't forget that. And they can be bad. What were you doing over there? Well, I guess brother so-and-so's over there. It's all right. I'm a new Christian. What do I know? See the danger of that? See how you can lead people astray without ever saying a word to them. He compelled the Gentiles, it says. That doesn't mean like, well, he kind of gave them a suggestion. Your actions gave carte blanche approval to, yep, we need to separate still. There's Christian Jews, and then there's Gentile Christians, and then, you know, we can get together for the Lord's Supper. You know, just think of the division that would have happened. You mentioned Ephesians chapter 4, Ephesians chapter 2. The middle wall of partition has been broken down. And this is something that they have to remember. So let's get into the argument a little bit. Stephen, if you could read, let's just get into it. I want you to please reread 14 and 15. Ruby, if you could do 16 and 17. Or just 16.
But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, being a Jew, live in the manner of Gentiles and not as the Jews, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews? We who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles.
Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ, even we have believed in Jesus Christ, that we might be justified by faith in Christ, and not by the works of the law, for by the works of the law no flesh shall be justified.
Aaron, pick back up here. Let's read the rest of the chapter just so we can get through it.
What verse did she read?
17.
But if while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is Christ therefore a minister of sin? Certainly not. For if I build again those things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I through the law died to the law that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain.
Okay. I always forget that this rebuke is this long. And getting ready for this class, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but I want to try to break it down succinctly. Like, why did he say what he said? That's what I asked my question is. It's like, he saw something wrong. He could have been like, hey, hypocrite, quit it! And that could have been it. That would have been a shorter chapter, wouldn't it? But he didn't. So my question, I kept asking myself, was like, what is he saying? What is he trying to communicate? Well, the first thing is that Stephen picked up is that it is the accusation. This is where the rebuke happened. And what type of sentence did he use? There's 4 kinds of sentences. What are they? There's declarative. There's interrogative. That's the kind he used. He asked a question. Think of the power of a rebuke of a question. When you do that, you're trying to pull something out of somebody, aren't you? Because really, what is Paul's question? Why are you doing this? You know it's not right. So look at the argument that he breaks down here. He said, why, if you being a Jew live in the manner of a Gentile and not as a Jew, why do you compel Gentiles to live as Jews? And so then, as the accusation begins, verses 15 and 16, this is where he's actually bringing into Old Testament law and New Testament law a legal perspective on this. And because look at what he says, knowing that a man, okay, verse 16, if you have any way of marking, if you want to know really what this whole book is about, if you want to sum it up in one phrase, verse 16, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. There you go. 6 chapters summed up right there. That's what he's talking about here. We don't live under the old law, we live under the new law that is in Christ Jesus. So verses 15 and 16, that he's showing the legal change from an Old Testament system to the New Testament system with a break in the middle in 17 and 18. Basically he's saying, and if that's not right, and I'm wrong, which you're not, if I'm wrong, then these 2 phrases will be true. It's actually a really good debate stance that he took in a very short amount of time. But he said, but if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves are found about sinners, Christ therefore a minister of sin? Certainly not. Basically he's saying, Peter, if you're going to believe this and you think that's true, you're making Christ a liar. You're making him a deliverer of sin. Look at verse 18. For if I build again on those things which I destroyed, I'd make myself a transgressor. What did Christ come to do? He came to fulfill the law. Destroy it? No, it had a place. But what he means here is not a destroyer of the old law, but what did we do? They put to death themselves when they became Christians. And what are they going back? Chapter 3 is like, oh, you foolish Galatians. Oh, you're going right back. That's what that verse is saying right there. He's like, I moved forward into the spirit of the new faith system in the New Testament. And I'm trying to, what I've put behind, I'm trying to go back to that. And so then 19 and 20. It says here, for I through the law died to the law. 19 and 20 are spiritual implications of it. We had the legal earlier, a couple examples if it was not true. So if you have basically the rebuke, the legal implications from the 2 laws, and if that legal implication was not true. So now we have spiritual, 19 and 20. And rereading that just briefly, for I through the law died to the law, that I might live to God. That is our new spiritual life. I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And this I mark down. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God. You go back to Romans, he talked about the old law and the fleshly side all the time. That was the comparison they had, the fleshly and the spirit. Faith, law. You know, it was constant comparison. So here we have this that we know so well. And then verse 21. I do not set aside the grace of God. For if righteousness comes through the law, what's it mean? What's it say? Christ died in vain. That was what he closed with Peter. I wish I could see the reaction. I wish I could have seen that, because Christ died in vain. Remember what I mentioned earlier? What do you think Peter always lived with? Denying Christ. Did he hang out with John at the cross when Jesus was crucified? Nope, he was already gone. John was the only of his disciples that were there. The guilt, the weight, everything like that. Did Peter, with the other guys, did they believe the women when they came back telling him? Not initially. Not initially. All that was a powerful argument. Powerful, obviously. I guess God inspired it, and it's like just a perfect word said to someone with that kind of background. Then if what you're doing is true, then Christ died in vain. That's powerful. That's a powerful argument.
Well, that would have hit him specifically like you talked about him denying him.
Yeah.
And that's just denying him all over again.
Exactly. It's like, he died for nothing. Like you did all that, it's like, he died for nothing. And one of the best evidences of apologetics, I think, is that the fact that these disciples who gained nothing from following Christ, all but one was martyred, is that why would you do that for something that wasn't real? It wasn't something true. That's something that you didn't fully believe in. So that's what I have on this. Chapter 3, a great chapter. This is when we get into more doctrinal sections. We're going to talk about Abraham, the gospel being preached to Abraham. That's cool. And then just so many other things like that. Before we close out, any comments?